Yeah.
This last hour has been a lot of fun to listen to because we've been engaging in what seems like a very thoughtful, fruitful, intelligent exercise in secular moral reasoning, which is an important thing to do. But I think why we all came here is because you seem to be claiming to do something much, much more interesting than that. Namely, that you could appeal to science to say something that's objectively true about morality, rather than simply use science as a way to feed us facts into the normal secular moral reasoning that we'd all like to think we could engage in. Yet when you put down the philosophical cornerstone of your case, you seem to appeal to common sense, sort of low-hanging fruit. Wouldn't everybody say it's objectively wrong, or it's really bad, as you put it when you sort of qualify your statement? Wouldn't you say it's bad to throw acid on someone's face? We'd all say it's bad, but that's not the philosophically interesting case that you were proposing to make. So it seems like you may be caught between either making a common sense argument on the one hand, or an inability to define your position in a strong sense on the other hand. How are you making that really interesting claim that we can turn to science to tell us what's objectively morally true without simply referring to the low-hanging fruit of throwing acid on people's faces and so on?
Yeah, good question. Well, the moment you grant that we're talking about well-being, that we're right to talk about well-being, we can't conceive of something else to talk about in this space, then all of the facts that determine well-being become the facts of science.
This is where Harris makes his fundamental error. He's essentially saying that once we accept well-being as the foundation of morality, then science can tell us everything we need to know about morality. But this commits what philosophers call the is-ought fallacy, jumping from descriptive facts to prescriptive values without justification. Just because science can tell us what affects well-being doesn't mean it can tell us that we should maximize well-being in the first place. Harris is smuggling in his own moral assumption, that well-being is what matters morally, and then claiming science validates this choice when science itself cannot make this fundamental value judgment.
Because well-being is emerging out of the laws of nature in some way. Our conscious states are constrained quite clearly by the laws of nature, whatever they turn out to be. If they entail ectoplasm rising off the brain at death and going to the Christian hell, we're still talking about the way the universe is.
Harris is trying to argue that even supernatural claims would fall under science's purview if they were true. But this misses the point entirely. The question isn't whether conscious states are constrained by natural laws. Of course they are. The question is whether the fact that something increases well-being automatically makes it morally good. Harris seems to think that by grounding morality in natural facts about consciousness, he's solved the is-ought problem, but he's actually just relocated it. He still needs to explain why we should care about well-being at all, and that's a normative question that science alone cannot answer.
And that would have to fall into the purview of some completed science. Now, obviously, there's no reason to believe in any of that. So you could ask a question like, just how important is compassion, say? I mean, what is compassion? What is the genetic basis for compassion? Is there what are the practices and uses of attention and institutions that allow compassion to thrive or diminish it?
Here Harris demonstrates exactly the kind of question begging that undermines his entire project. He's asking, how important is compassion, as if science can answer this question objectively. But science can only tell us what compassion is, what its effects are, how it works neurologically. It cannot tell us how much we should value it. That's a moral judgment that depends on prior commitments about what makes life worth living, what our obligations to others are, and what kind of society we want to create. These are philosophical and value-laden questions that require moral reasoning, not just empirical investigation.
And if there's a trade-off, I mean, just how important is compassion, and if we have a tension between compassion and bureaucratic efficiency, say, what is the right balance there? Now, again, these are all the details at the level of brains and the level of lived experience are incredibly complicated. If you get to conditions where it's just not at all clear which way to go, you're getting to conditions where figuring out which way to go in detail would be incredibly complicated, much more complicated than economics. And economics is still struggling to be a science. But I mean, so clearly we don't understand economic systems with any real success at this point. We can keep being blindsided by how they behave, but nobody doubts that there are right and wrong ways to respond to a global banking catastrophe.
This is a classic example of Harris's strategy of using extreme examples to make his point seem more plausible than it actually is. Yes, most people would agree that deliberately destroying all wealth during an economic crisis would be counterproductive. But this consensus doesn't prove that science can determine moral truths. It just shows that people generally share certain basic assumptions about human welfare and social cooperation. The interesting moral questions arise precisely where there isn't this kind of obvious consensus. Should we prioritize equality over efficiency? How much should we sacrifice for future generations? What do we owe to other species? These questions can't be answered by pointing to extreme cases where everyone agrees.
And I think to carve out a space of truth, of real truth, a space where we recognize there are truth claims to be made about good and evil, or truth claims to be made about economics, all we have to acknowledge are the easy cases. I mean, that's why I appeal to the easy cases, because it's like, with economics, economists can disagree about how to respond to a global economic crisis. The science is such, and the complexity of the system under analysis is such that we may never be confident about the right answer, but we know there are wrong answers. If someone got on CNN and said, well, I've got the solution, let's just destroy all material wealth. Let's just have a huge potlatch where we just burn buildings and ruin everything. Okay, and then we'll have to build it again, and that's a brilliant idea. It's going to put everyone to work. Okay, that's pretty clearly the wrong answer. Now, so we know there are right and wrong answers. We know there are ways to fail where your beliefs can be erroneous, and I'm arguing this if it's true for something like economics, it's also true for morality.
Harris's analogy between economics and morality is deeply flawed. Economics, at its core, is about efficiently allocating scarce resources to satisfy given preferences. But morality is about what preferences we should have in the first place, what goals are worth pursuing, and how we should treat others. Even if we could perfectly predict the consequences of our actions, which we can't, we'd still need to make valued judgments about which consequences matter and how much they matter. The fact that economists can sometimes identify obviously bad policies doesn't mean economics is a science in the same way physics is, and it certainly doesn't mean we can build a science of morality on the same foundation. Harris is essentially arguing that because we can sometimes identify moral failures, we can build a complete scientific framework for moral truth, but this is like saying that because we can identify obviously bad music, we can create a science of aesthetic value. What we've just witnessed is nothing short of intellectual fraud dressed up in the language of rationality. Sam Harris has spent years peddling what is essentially a philosophical shell game, and this clip reveals the sleight of hand in all its glory. He's not solving the ancient problem of deriving not from is, he's pretending it doesn't exist while committing the very fallacy he claims to transcend. Let's be brutally honest about what Harris is actually doing here. He's taking his own subjective moral intuitions about well-being, intuitions that happen to align with liberal Western values, and retroactively claiming they're objective scientific truths. This isn't groundbreaking philosophy, it's elaborate question-begging with a neuroscience PhD attached. When he says, we can't conceive of something else to talk about besides well-being, he's not making a logical argument, he's admitting he lacks the imagination to understand that other cultures and philosophical traditions have conceived of radically different moral frameworks for millennia. The man who positions himself as a champion of reason is essentially arguing that his personal moral preferences are facts of nature. This is the same kind of thinking that led previous generations of supposedly rational thinkers to declare their cultural biases as universal truths. The only difference is that Harris racks his prejudices in the language of brain scans and consciousness studies instead of divine command or natural law. And let's talk about that economics analogy. It's not just weak, it's actively misleading. Economics at least has the honesty to admit it's working with given preferences and constraints. When an economist says, destroying all wealth is bad, They're not claiming this is a universal moral truth. They're saying it's inefficient given certain assumptions about human goals. Harris wants to have it both ways. He wants the authority of science but applied to questions that science simply cannot answer. The most insidious part of Harris's project is how it masquerades as humble empiricism while actually being breathtakingly arrogant. He's essentially claiming that thousands of years of moral philosophy can be swept away because we now have brain imaging technology. Never mind that cultures across the globe have developed sophisticated ethical systems that prioritize duty, honor, spiritual transcendence, or collective harmony over individual well-being. Never mind that some of history's most admired moral figures, from Socrates to Gandhi to Martin Luther King, explicitly chose principles over well-being when the two conflicted. Harris's moral landscape is really just a topographical map of his own values, projected onto the universe and declared objective. When he talks about peaks and valleys of well-being, he's not describing features of reality, he's describing the contours of his own moral imagination. The fact that he can't see this reveals either stunning philosophical naivety or deliberate intellectual dishonesty. This is what happens when someone smart enough to understand the technical aspects of neuroscience decides they can short-circuit centuries of philosophical inquiry. Harris has convinced himself that because he can measure neural correlates of suffering and happiness, he's discovered the source code of morality itself. It's like claiming you understand music because you can measure sound waves, or that you understand love because you can map the neurochemistry of attachment. The tragedy is that Harris's influence extends far beyond academic philosophy. His ideas provide intellectual cover for a kind of militant rationalism that's just as dogmatic as any religious fundamentalism. When someone believes their moral views are backed by science itself, they become immune to genuine moral reasoning and debate. They don't need to engage with alternative perspectives because they've already declared them scientifically false. What Harris has actually accomplished is the creation of a secular religion with himself as both prophet and pope. His followers get to feel rationally superior while holding on to their existing moral beliefs without having to defend them through actual argument. It's the perfect ideology for people who want the certainty of fundamentalism wrapped in the language of skepticism. The real kicker is that Harris's entire project collapses the moment you ask the one question he desperately wants to avoid: why should we care about well-being at all? His answer, that we can't conceive of anything else to care about, isn't philosophy, it's a failure of imagination masquerading as logical necessity. Any honest moral philosopher will tell you that this question has haunted ethics for millennia precisely because it can't be answered through empirical investigation alone. Sam Harris hasn't solved the is-ought problem. He's simply declared it solved while committing the very fallacy he claims to transcend. And the fact that he's built a career on this intellectual house of cards says less about the power of his ideas than it does about our collective hunger for simple answers to complex questions. In the end, Harris's moral science is neither moral nor scientific, it's just another ideology desperately trying to claim the authority of objective truth.